Okay. Good morning. So nice to see all of you. I'd like to look together with you this morning at a fascinating topic, making up missed Torah readings in halacha and history. As we begin to ease the restrictions here in the state of Israel, Baruch Hashem, and shuls prepare to open their doors, one very practical question, among many questions, but one very practical question that arises is, will shuls have to make up all of the Torah readings missed during their closure? I mean, if you think about it, we've missed many, many weeks of reading the Torah. We've missed basically almost, if we don't get back to shul by this Shabbat, we'll have missed the entire Sefer Vayikra. And what's interesting is we'll see together this morning, this is not the first time in Jewish history that the question has been raised. So I'll share with you on the Zoom the source sheets for those who don't have the source sheets. 1 second, let's do this. Oh, no. Okay, bear with me for just a moment. Share the source sheets. Okay, here we go. Okay, so as I said, this is not the first time in Jewish history that this question has been raised. If you take a look at source number 1, this is from Sefer Or Zarua, very, very important work that records halacha and plays a very important role in the development of Minhag Ashkenaz. Or Zarua is the work of Rav Yitzchak of Vienna, who lived in the 13th century. They place him around 1200 to 1270. Some have him a little earlier, being born already in the late 12th century, around 1180. He was a member of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. He studied under the Ravia, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, Rabbi Shimshon Mikutzi, the Baal Rokeach, Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, and he was one of the primary teachers of the Maharami Rutenberg. So the Or Zarua was one of the very influential Chachmei Ashkenaz, and his work, the Or Zarua, again, as I mentioned, is very important in understanding the development of Minhag Ashkenaz and of what we assume to be the Ashkenazic customs and practices and halachot that we Ashkenazic Jews observe. And he records an incident that took place in Cologne, Germany, where the community missed the Torah reading of Parashat Emor. And the question was, do they have to make it up the following week? Again, this is so relevant to our current situation. It's even this week. The question was asked, 800 plus years ago in Germany, in the Rhine Valley, this very week. They missed Emor, and what do they do the next week? Parashat Behar. A little bit different. We don't know that it was a double parsha, but that'll actually be important. We'll see in a moment. Cologne, of course, is in the Rhine Valley. It's around 200 kilometers northwest of Frankfurt. About 10 years ago, I've been to Frankfurt to teach a number of times, but about 10 years ago, I was a scholar in residence over Shavuot in Frankfurt. And then they had some sort of legal holiday, some sort of national holiday. And so they sent me on a train before I went home and flew back to Tel Aviv. They sent me from Frankfurt to Cologne and Cologne to Essen. And I spoke to the Jewish communities in Cologne and in Essen. Today, the Jewish communities in Germany are primarily made up of people from the former Soviet Union. They're doing a lot of good kiruv and a lot of good work there. And in Cologne, I gave a few shiurim on it was a Sunday morning or a Monday morning in this big, beautiful neo-Romanesque Runstrasse synagogue with rose windows. If anyone's ever seen it, it was the only shul there that survived the Nazis. And then I took the train from there to Essen and then back to the airport in Frankfurt. So the Or Zarua here in source number 1, okay, after that long introduction, writes the following, okay, where I've underlined, Ma'aseh haya beKolonia. An incident took place in Cologne, be'echad shekibel b'Shabbat, hara'ui likrot parashat Emor, el ha'kohanim, v'ikev tefillah b'kriyat Torah kol hayom. We don't know exactly what happened, but for some reason they were not able to daven that week. They were not able to daven and to read the Torah on Shabbat Emor. Ukeshigia Shabbat Haba'ah. So the next week, Parashat Behar, right? Or maybe Behar B'chukotai, not so clear. Seems to be maybe just Behar. But Tziva HaRebbi Eliezer Berebbi Shimon. Some sources have it Berebbi Shimshon Zatzal. So the Or Zarua cites the ruling of another rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Shimon, or as I said, Shimshon, Latchil beparashat Emor el HaKohanim, v'likrota v'gam behar Sinai, hara'uya lihakrot be'ota Shabbat. Okay, so it's interesting. The Or Zarua cites approvingly the ruling of this Rabbi Eliezer, who ruled that the community should read not just Behar, which is the parasha for that week, Haruya lehakrot be'ota Shabbat, the parasha for that week, but also to make it up and to read Parashat Emor, the previous parasha, the previous week's reading. V'shelo lidaleg pam achat min haTorah. And the Or Zarua now is saying that he's explaining the ruling that they should not skip over or miss even once one parsha from the Torah. Lefi ki mimot Moshe Rabbeinu nitaken likrot haTorah beparshiyoteha. It was already enacted in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu to read from the Torah according to its parasha, ulahashlima bechol shana v'shana, and to complete the entire Torah and all of its parshiot each and every year. Kidei lahashmiya la'am mitzvot v'chukim, in order to make heard to the nation all of the mitzvot, the commandments, the statutes. Ve'en lecha lomar kevan she'avar zman kriyata halchala, and we don't say that just since the time passed, since it's no longer parashat Emor, oh, that's it. It's oisyantif, if you can't read anymore. No, we don't say that. Kevan she'avar zman kriyata halchala, there's no longer an obligation since the time has passed. Right? Halchala ota parsha. Lefi ki ein keva beparshot. There's no set or fixed time specific to the parsha. Likur parsha zo b'shabbat zo, v'zo b'shabbat zo. Parshat Emor doesn't have to be read on that specific Shabbat or on this specific Shabbat, right? Ella ki kein nizderu haparshiot. That's just how the parshiot were ordered, but it doesn't have to be read. It's not like Parshat Emor has to be read on whatever date in ER it is. The Ra'ila Davar, and a proof for it, he writes, is that Sh'im Yera Yom Tov b'Shabbat, if Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, right? What do? Im Yera Yom Tov b'Shabbat b'dochin parasha shelo haShabbat mipnei parasha shel Yom Tov. What happens when Yom Tov coincides with Shabbat? You push off that week's Torah portion till after the Yom Tov, right? And you read the special reading for that Yom Tov on that Shabbat. Okay, instead, you don't read the normal weekly Torah portion. So, and he writes, Halo miyad b'Shabbat hasmucha Yom Tov chozer lemakom shepasak. Right? And so what? The following Shabbat, or the Shabbat right after the holiday, right next to the holiday, the immediate Shabbat following the holiday, you go back, chozer lemakom shepasak. You go back to the place where you stopped, and you read what you should have read on that previous Shabbat, except that previous Shabbat was Yom Tov. Right? This is something that we're all familiar with. We don't say that, well, since it's pushed off, since we already pushed off, we should push it off entirely and just skip that parasha, right? What do? No, you wait until Yom Tov is over, and then you read the parasha that should have been read on the previous Shabbat that coincided with Yom Tov. So for the Or Zarua, that's a proof, okay, that you don't push it off entirely. You have an obligation, he writes, to read every single parasha, and you see that you can make up a parasha following a Yom Tov. So in this case, if for whatever reason a Torah reading was missed or skipped, you would make it up, okay? And he adds a few other points. He writes, "Ve'en lomar she'en likrot mishum torach tzibur." We don't say that you don't make up a Torah reading because of tircha de tzibur, because it's a burden on the community. It would burden the community, a burden that the community cannot bear. Now that point is important. We'll come back to that because some say, well, maybe it is. Maybe it is a tircha de tzibura, especially if we're talking about multiple weeks, multiple parshiot, okay? And then he continues, and at the end he cites the Rambam. And the Rambam writes, a katav, Rav Moshe Maimon Zatzal, haminhag hapashut. The simple minhag, the established, accepted practice is l'kol Yisrael shemashlimin et Torah b'shana achat. Okay, that we complete the entire Torah in 1 year. And the Rambam writes, and I put it here in source number 2, the Rambam writes at the end of that halacha, it's in Hilchot Tfilah, Perek Yud Gimel Halacha Aleph, he writes at the very end, V'yesh mi shemashlim et Torah b'shalosh shanim, ve'eno minhag pashut, ad kan lashono. The Rambam mentions that there are those who complete the Torah once in 3 years, but that is not the accepted practice. Okay, now it's interesting. The Gemara in Masechet Megillah and Daf Chavtet Amud Bet mentions that the practice in Bavel was to complete the Torah in 1 year. The practice in Eretz Yisrael, the minhag in Eretz Yisrael, was to complete the Torah every 3 years. They read on a triennial cycle. And it would seem that still in the days of the Rambam, writing in the 12th century, there were those who still had the custom to complete the Torah once in 3 years. I put the Rambam here in source number 2. Okay, so it's interesting that he cites the Rambam to, on the one hand, suggest, oh, look, we have an obligation to complete the entire Torah in 1 year. And that's why, according to the Or Zarua, we have an obligation to make up any missed parasha. On the other hand, he also cites the Rambam as having said that there are those who have the custom to complete the Torah cycle once in 3 years, which is important because maybe that would allow for those who want to be lenient and say we don't have to make up all these parshiot, and it's not such a loss, not such a problem, because the custom in Eretz Yisrael was to complete the Torah once in 3 years. So we didn't read it in Tafshin Pei, so we'll read that parsha in Tafshin Pei Aleph. And after 3 years, Mirz Hashem, we will have read the entire Torah. So it's interesting, and we'll see in a moment, there's machloket as to how to understand the Or Zarua. But it's interesting that he cites that Rambam seemingly to say, oh, we have an obligation to read the entire Torah in 1 year, therefore we have to make up a missed parsha, right? But on the other hand, the Rambam himself allows for the Torah to be read once in 3 years, where seemingly you would not have to read or make up a parsha because you could get it the next year, okay? So the Or Zarua here, he tells us a few things. Number one, you have to make up a missed parsha. Okay, but we'll ask a question in a moment. What does he mean by that? What if it's multiple parsha? Number two, he says every parsha must be heard. Right? Now, a question we'll ask a little later on this morning is the chovah, the obligation, on the tzibur, on the community, or on the yachid, on the individual, to hear the Torah reading or to read the Torah publicly? And that's a very important question. It's an important nafkamina. 3, the Or Zarua quotes the Rambam, as we just mentioned, that the Torah has to be completed every year, but the Rambam records that some communities still observe the minhag Eretz Yisrael and complete the Torah once in 3 years. So what does the Or Zarua mean by that, right, in citing the Rambam? And finally, number 4, the Or Zarua points out this is not called tircha de tzibura, which also we'll have to come back to and examine. It's not burdening the community. What does he mean? Does he mean it's not a burden to read just one extra parsha? Right? What if you miss the entire Sefer Vayikra? Like is unfortunately the case here. It would take hours and hours, right? That would certainly be a tircha de tzibura. So it's interesting. The Ramah here in Kuf Lamed Hey, the Or Chaim, I put down in source number 6. The Ramah paskins like the Or Zarua. Right? The Ramah, in his glosses to Shulchan Aruch Or Chaim Kuf Lamed Hey, writes in bitlu Shabbat achat, where I've underlined kriyat haparasha b'tzibur, if a week was missed in the public Torah reading, l'Shabbat haba korin ota parasha im parasha hashayach ota Shabbat. So you make it up the next week. Right? That's what the Ramah says. And as you see here, he's quoting the Or Zarua. But again, the intent of the Or Zarua is not so clear. Did the Or Zarua intend that you make up one missed parsha? What if you have many parashiot that were missed, that were skipped? That's the question. Okay. So it's interesting. I put here in source number 4 just one line from the Sefer Agudah. The Sefer Agudah, Rav Alexander Zuslin HaKohen, died in 1349. Very important 14th century German posek, and wrote commentaries on the Gemara. He was actually died al Kiddush Hashem, killed in the Erfurt massacre in 1349, which was during the Black Death, Black Plagues. Of course, the people in Europe blamed the Jews for the Black Death, and so there were massacres of hundreds of communities throughout Europe. And in Erfurt, Germany, there was a massacre in 1349, and the Aguda dies al Kiddush Hashem. So look at the way he formulates this ruling of the Or Zarua. It's very important. He writes the following: Sefer Or Zarua, im bitlu b'Shabbat hatamid v'lo kar'u haparasha. If they, for whatever reason, didn't read the Torah that week and missed that parsha, yikru haparasha b'Shabbat haba'a shtei parshiot. The following week, you read 2 parshiot. That's the way he formulates it. That you read, not that you make it up, but that you read 2 parshiot. And that's important because, as we'll see in a moment, the Maharam Mintz will cite the way the Aguda formulates this ruling of the Or Zarua. And the Maharam Mintz will suggest that you only read 2 parshiot and no more. So that, for example, if there's a double parsha the following week, right? So you wouldn't read 3 parshiot. Or he also has a problem with connecting 2 sarim, right? If you missed the last parsha or the last 2 parshiot in Shemot, for instance, we'll see in a moment. If you missed Vayakel Pekude, let's say, so he has 2 problems with it, the Maharam Mintz. He'll say, number one, the following week, Shabbat Vayikra, you wouldn't read 3 because that's already too much. That's a tircha de tzibura. Okay? The Or Zarua, according to the Maharam Mintz, is assuming you only make up 1 parsha the following week. But if you had a double parsha, right, or if it's 2 different svarim, the Maharam Mintz will say you're not mashlim, you don't make it up. Or if you have many parshiot, like is our situation here, due to the closures of shuls because of this pandemic. So according to the Maharam Mintz, you wouldn't make up multiple parshiot. Again, this formulation of the Aguda is extremely important in understanding the way the Maharam Mintz wants to understand the Or Zarua. Okay, so as I said, there's a machloket, a dispute, a debate as to how to understand the Or Zarua. Does the Or Zarua mean that you make up a parsha the next week, just like 1 week, or what if it's multiple weeks? What if it's a double parsha? Okay, so the Maharam Mintz, Moshe ben Yitzchak Halevi Mintz, 15th century Germany, writing about 2 centuries after the Or Zarua. He's a Talmud of the Mahari Weil and he's a very close friend of the Trumat Hadeshen, Yisrael Isserlein, who was in touch with constantly. He was a Rav in Germany, also was a Rav in Poland. So the Maharam Mintz, he writes the following, okay, here in source number 5. Masha Shalta, he's now recording an incident that happened in Mainz. Okay, sorry, in Worms. I get confused. Mainz and Worms, they're very close to one another. I've been to both. That same trip, I've been to Germany a number of times, but that same trip when I was in Frankfurt and Cologne and Essen, we mentioned Cologne before, we also spent time in Mainz and Worms. So it's the following, Masha Shalta, what you've asked, al ma'aseh she'ira kilat kedosha vermais. Okay, what happened, this incident that took place in Worms, B'Shabbat Parashat HaChodesh, Vayakel Pekudei, it was Shabbos HaChodesh, Vayakel Pekudei, right? Long davening, okay? Parashat HaChodesh, double Parsha, double Torah portion of Vayakel Pekudei, Mechubarim Likrot Yachad, which are connected to be read at once, right? Which we're all familiar with. V'nikra'u Shisha Gavrei Kidina. So they called up 6 aliyot, right? As is the custom. Ukishachazan koreh hashvi'i lahashlim hasefer. Oh, nafal tagar ben shnei gavra. Right? This never happens. Fights never break out in shuls. He writes that when the Gabbai went to call up the 7th Ole, a fight broke out in shul between 2 men. Now, we don't know exactly what the fight was, but my assumption is, my hunch, my guess would be that the fight was over who got the choshev aliyah of the 7th aliyah of Shvi, right? This is Shvi Chazak. This is the person who's going to be called up to complete Sefer Shmot, right? To finish Vayakel Pekudei. So this is a very, very choshev aliyah. So the Maharam Mintz records that in Worms, this fight broke out between 2 people. Ad Sefer Torah munachat batel. So until the Sefer Torah was just sitting there, and no one was doing anything. ונמשך זה כנגד בית שעות, שלא יכלו להשוותן איזה מהן לקרות לשביעי לסיום הספר. Right, actually, he does tell you what the exact fight was. 2 hours went by. They were fighting for 2 hours, and they couldn't figure out, which one of them should finish the Sefer, should get the 7th Aliyah. Ad shalchu, or read the 7th Aliyah. Ad shalchu kimat kol ha'ka'al chutz lebeit ha'knesset. Okay, this is important. Until the majority of the shul got up and left. Most of the minyan walked out. V'lachu imahem Sefer Torah mitoch Aron HaKodesh. And they took with them a sefer from the Aron. V'alchu lebeit knesset shel bachurim shekorim tzumersh. Don't know the origin or the exact translation of the word tzumersh, but they took the Torah with them and they went to the youth minyan, so to speak, the Beit Knesset shel bachurim, right? The youth minyan, the Beis Medrash, where the young people daven. Maybe a classroom, maybe that's what it means. V'sham karu shvi'i, and there they read the 7th Aliyah. V'hishlimu asidra kitikunim, and they finished the 7th Aliyah. They finished the sidra, right? V'lo nish'ar b'veit hakneset shel Irak dalid ohei anashim, and there were only about 4 or 5 people who were involved in this tumult that were left in the shul, right? Otam balei machloket v'tzirufa, the people that were involved in this this sichsuch, if you will. V'ata atem mechulakim eich likrot b'shabbat achar kach b'shabbat shel vayikra. He says, and now there's a machloket in the community as to what to do the following week. Should they make up Vayakel Pekudei? Should they read 3 parshiot? What should be done? Now, he continues, and I'll just summarize for the sake of time, but he continues and gives a number of reasons why he feels that you can be makil, you can be lenient, you don't have to go back and read Vayakel Pekudei based on this incident, okay? And he rules, Nira li de'en likrot b'shabbat haba Vayakel Pekudei rak matchil sidra d'shavua dehu vayikra. He says the following week, you don't have to make up Vayakel Pekudei, you only have to read Vayikra, the Torah portion for that week. That's what you read that Shabbos. Shabbos Vayikra, you read Parashat Vayikra. That's what he rules. He gives a number of reasons because you had a group, it maybe wasn't the entire shul, but you had a group that did indeed finish the reading in that classroom, he writes. He gives a number of different reasons why they could be makil. But towards the bottom, and this is important for our discussion this morning, he writes the following. Mikol makom, says, nevertheless, ein shayach, it's not relevant. Likrot b'shabbat haba gimel sidrot, vayakel pekudei im vayikra. It wouldn't make sense to read Vayakel Pekudei and Vayikra, 3 parshiot in 1 week. Ki din ze lo matzinu. We don't have such a precedent. We don't find that din or that halacha mentioned anywhere. Ki im b'sefer Ozarua meitei lav aguda, right? Perek hakore v'zel l'shono. He says we have in the Or Zarua, which is what we saw, and as cited in the Aguda, which we began with, which is what we saw just a few minutes ago. He says, in his comments to Perek HaKoreh, V'zel L'shono, he says that if you be'or zarua im batlu or im bitlu b'Shabbat tamid v'lo karu haparasha az yikru b'Shabbat haba shnei parshiot ad kam l'shono. He's citing the Aguda, and that's significant because the Aguda dafka mentions 2. If you miss one week, so the next week you read 2. And for the Mara Mintz, he's medayik in that lashon. 2, but not 3. Okay. Hine lo katuv rakim bitel haShabbat echad tamid az yikru b'Shabbat haba shnei sidrot. It's only written that you read 2. Aval lo katav. He didn't write in bitel gimel o dalid Shabbatot yikru kol otan sidrot b'Shabbat echad. If you miss 3 or 4 parshas, you read them all in one Shabbos. V'chein mistabre de im lo kein el davar sof. And that would simply be, if we don't say that it's limited, that this hashlamah, making up parshiot, is limited to just reading 2 parshiot on one Shabbos, if we don't say that, en davar sof, right? It would never end. You'd have a situation like maybe we have now, where when we finally get back together, people will have to read the entire Sefer Vayikra, okay? Which we'll see might be another issue, according to the Maharem Mitz. But the first point that he makes is, number one, he says, if you look closely at the way he's reading the Or Zarua, and specifically the way he's reading the Aguda, the way the Aguda formulates, recites the ruling of the Or Zarua, he's saying it only means, the intent of the Or Zarua is only making up 1 week, where maximum you read on one Shabbos 2 parshiot and no more. Okay, and perhaps that is based on the fact that we have a precedent for double parshiot, right? Vayakel Pekude. We have Shabbatot where we read 2 parshiot together. This Shabbat would be Behar Pikuchotai, right? It is Behar Pikuchotai. We read 2 parshiot together, parshiot mechubarot. So we have a precedent for 2, but not for more than that, right? And he says if we allow for more, ein ladavar sof. Okay, so that's the first point he makes, and then he makes an additional point that's relevant to our discussion and relevant to our current situation. He says ve'od yesh griuta hacha, also would be very bad, right? Another bad thing, negative thing with this specific case. Kevan de pekude have siyum hasefer. Ein svara b'shabbat echad likrot misefer lesefer. Dezelo matzinu b'shum duchta. Here's another problem. A second issue. If you make up V'yakel Pekude in Shabbat Vayikra, now we find we're reading from the end of Sefer Shmot when we're supposed to be beginning Sefer Vayikra. And he says there's also no precedent to read from one Sefer when we're supposed to already have started another Sefer. Okay, so 2 issues that are relevant to our discussion this morning. Number 1, he says there's no precedent to read more than 2 parshiot per Shabbat. Okay, so he reads the Or Zarua and the Aguda that you can't make up more than 1 parsha. Okay, maximally reading 2 parshiot on a Shabbat. And number 2, you can't read from one Sefer to another Sefer. You can't make Svarim like that. Okay, again, both situations, he writes, we don't have a precedent for. We don't have a precedent that we have a precedent for Vayakel Pekude, but we don't have a precedent for Pekude Vayikra, right? So that's what he's saying. Now that's an important point, because we'll see a little bit later on this morning that the Aruch HaShulchan will ask if that's really so, and we'll assume that if we do have an obligation to hear, as the Or Zarua himself writes, every single parsha and read publicly every single parsha from the Torah, so who says you can't read more than 2 parshiot per week? Who says that you can't read 3, 4, 5 or more in 1 week? And who says that you can't make up parshiot from Sefer Shmot when we're already in Sefer Vayikra, or parshiot from Sefer Vayikra if we're already in Bamidbar, V'chulei, etc. Okay, so it's interesting. So there's a machloket achronim as to how to understand the Or Zarua, how to interpret the Or Zarua, and how to implement the Or Zarua. The Magen Avram here in source number 7, and a number of achronim, a number of important poskim like the Knesset Hagdolah and Rav Shlomo Kluger and the Shvut Yaakov of Yaakov Reischer rule like the Maharam Mintz and limit the obligation to making up just 1 missed parsha with no more than 2 parshiot read on 1 particular Shabbat. Because reading 3 or more would be a tircha de tzibura, that would be a burden on the community. So that's the Magen Avram here. It would seem that that would also be the position of the Biur HaGra, that you could only make up 1 parasha the following week and not have a situation where you're making up multiple parshiot. Okay, the Gra here in source number 8 in his Biur HaGra, which is, it's a collection of his very cryptic comments on the Shulchan Aruch. Oftentimes it's like footnotes. He's citing different places in the rabbinic literature, the Talmudic literature, even the Midrashic literature, where he believes is the source for the Shulchan Aruch, the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. So here, he writes just a few words, and it's fascinating, okay? And it's the subject of much rich debate and discussion as to what the Gra here means. But the Vilna Gaon writes the following here in source number 8. When the Ramah says that there's an obligation to make up a missed Torah reading on the following Shabbat, the Gra writes, Kimo shekatuv b'tfilah ta'av lo yitpalel. He cites the Gemara in Brachot that says that if a person under tefillah, we know there is a concept of tashlumin. They make it up, right? The next the next tefillah. So if a person missed shacharit, they would say 2 amidot for tefillat mincha. It's a rich sugya in Masechet Brachot, of course. So here, the Gra writes that this halacha, right, the source, because it's a whole question as to what is the source for the Or Zarua in saying that you should make up a missed parasha. It's not clear. It would seem that according to the Or Zarua, the source is the fact that we have to read and hear and read publicly every single parasha in the Torah, right, to make heard, as he writes, the Am, to the nation, that the Torah and the mitzvot. But what's his source? So according to the Gra, the source is the halacha is learned out, so to speak, from this din of tefillat tashlumin, that if you miss one tefillah, you make it up the next tefillah. Now, that's significant. How far do you take that analogy? Okay, what does he really mean by that? Now, with tefillat tashlumin, you can only make up one tefillah, right? If you miss shacharit, you make it up in mincha. You say an extra amidah for mincha. But if you miss shacharit and mincha, come Arvit, you don't make up Shachrit, Mincha, and Arvit, and say Arvit. You don't have 3 tefillot. So some want to suggest that maybe that's the intent of the Gra here, that the Gra is ruling like the Maharam Mintz and the Magen Avram and others who say that you just make up one parsha. And if it's more parshiot, no, you never have a situation where you make up 3 parshiot in one Shabbat or more. Maximum 2 parshiot in one Shabbat. The Haraya, according to the Gra, Tfilat Tashlumin. Okay, others question that. Well, with tefillah tashlumin, if it's done b'meizid, if a person intentionally misses a tefillah, we don't allow him to go ahead and make up that tefillah in the subsequent tefillah because he did it b'meizid. It's only in a case of onyx. So what if, some ask, it's a rich discussion in the Achronim based on this Gra, what if a person or a community intentionally missed a Torah reading? Are they able to make it up, or do we say, oh, no, the din comes from tefillat tashlumin, just like with tashlumin, by tefillah, you can't make it up if done intentionally, so too by kriyat Torah. So that's a rich discussion, but not for now. But there's a question whether the Gra really meant this, or really paskined like the Maharam Mintz, that you only make up 1 week, because we have in a sefer the Tosefet Ma'aserav. Ma'aserav records the practices of the Vilna Gaon. It's a very, very small sefer, but really very rich, and there are a lot of commentaries written on it. So then there's a sefer called Tosefet Ma'aserav, which has additional material, additional comments and stories. And in that sefer, Tosefet Ma'aserav, it's recorded that the Vilna Gaon was falsely imprisoned. We know that the Vilna Gaon was once imprisoned on some trumped-up charges. And when he was finally released, the Vilna Gaon himself had 4 parshiot read for him upon his release, the 4 parshiot that he missed. So it's difficult to kind of reconcile that account, that story, with what he writes in the Biur HaGra. Again, depending on how you want to understand this. If he means that the making up parshiot is exactly like the din of making up tefillot, so then you would only be able to make up 1 parsha, just as you can only make up 1 tefillah. Okay, but again, that's problematic with what's recorded in Tosefet Ma'aserav. Okay, in any case, the Mishnah Berurah here in source number 9, the Mishnah Berurah, he understands the Gaon to rule in accord with the Maharam Mintz, that the Gaon is saying that no, this din of making up Torah readings is just like making up tefillot. And therefore, just like the Maharam Mintz says, you can only make up 1 parasha and no more, so too, the Gra, in comparing it to tefillat tashlumin, is saying that you can only make up 1 parasha, just like you can only make up 1 tefillah. That's how the Mishnah Berurah at least understands the Vilna Gaon. Again, how far do you take this comparison? That's beyond the scope of our class this morning. But the Mishnah Berurah, he begins here in source number 9 by saying it indeed is a machloket. It's a machloket among the Achronim as to exactly what we do. Do you make up only 1 parasha, or can you make up many parshut? Are you obligated to make up many parshiot? That's the question. So he writes the following: the im bitlu kama shabbatot, the Mishnah writes here in source number 9, if many Torah readings were missed, many weeks of Torah reading were missed, yesh omrim, there are those who say, de'en likrot b'shabbat haba'a ki masidra achrona hasmucha lezo. There are those who say that you only read 1 parasha, the last parasha that was missed, the parasha that immediately preceded the current Shabbat. Okay, that is the Maharam Mintz. The Yesh Omrim, and there are those who say that Tzarich Lashlim B'Tzibur Kol Hasidrot Shebitlu. There are those, we'll see in a moment, who say that you have to read every single parsha that was missed, each and every parsha. Okay, and then he concludes, Mibir Agra, from the comments of the Gra, Mashma Desvira Lekeadeh Rishona, as we explained. It would seem that the Gaon follows like that first opinion, that opinion of the Maharam Mintz. In source number 10, I put a short comment of the glosses to the Sefer Hamin Hagim Tirna. What is the Sefer Hamin Hagim of Tirna? Very, very important work. Also crucial in understanding the development of Minhag Ashkenaz. It's the work of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac of Tirna, lived in Austria in the 15th century. And on that work of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac of Tirna, on his Sefer Hamin Hagim, we have glosses, but we don't know who the author is. Right? So in those anonymous glosses, it's recorded the following. Here in source number 10, he quotes the Maharam Mintz, right? He writes, Chilek Dafka, Bed Parshot, Aval Gimel Parshot, Kigoni B'Shabbat Shavar, Hayu Kfulin, Lo, Ayin Sham, right? He cites the Maharam Mintz, which we saw, which says that you only read 2 parshiot, and if the previous week was a double parsha, Vayakel Pekude, you wouldn't read 3 parshiot. There's no precedent for that, as we saw. Avalon Yirin Dvarav Be'inai. And so the anonymous author to these glosses on the Sefer Hamin Hagim of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac of Tirna writes, I don't agree. Lo Yirin Dvarav Be'inai. I don't agree with the Maharam Mintz. He doesn't explain why. But as many explain, the reason is because there's an obligation to hear each and every Torah reading and to have each and every parsha read publicly. And that's what the Eliyahu Rabbah here on the Shulchan Aruch writes in source number 11. Okay? So the Eliyahu Rabbah here, he quotes this passage from the glosses to the Sefer Hamin Hagim, and he explains why. He says, V'chein mistaber ta'amo, de'ein ledaleg shum parasha. The reason is, you can't skip out, you can't miss any Torah reading. V'od lefi shematzati tam b'gilyon Mordechai Katan, Reish Brachot, he cites the Mordechai Katan, Zel Shono, mimot Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom, nitkina likro b'parshiot, lahashmiya l'rabim, ad kan. Umashma de'ein chiluk klal. He assumes there's an obligation already, as we saw in the Or Zarua, from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu to read each and every parsha, to make each and every parsha heard to the Bnei Yisrael. Okay, the Or Zarua himself mentioned that. That's why some want to say that maybe even according to the Or Zarua, there's room for reading more than one parsha. The Or Zarua never said you cannot. The Or Zarua just said what do? You miss 1 week, you make it up the following week because there's an obligation to read the Torah publicly. He didn't say you can't. So some want to say, here, the Or Zarua himself mentions the reason that we have an obligation already from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu to read the Torah publicly. Okay? Umashma, de'ein chiluk klal. No one argues on that, the Eliyahu Rabbah writes. Umikol shekain, all the more so. Kishe shtayim dvukot b'Shabbat zu shekarim nami sidra shel Shabbat ha'avar, ulefi ze nira li, hu hadin kishe bitlu shnayim o shlosha Shabbatot yikru kol haparshiot shebitlu b'pam achat. The Eliyahu Rabbah paskins that if you miss a double parsha, so the following week you read 3 parshiot, or if you miss many parshiot, you have an obligation to make it up. Okay, and there are many achronim that paskin like the Eliyahu Rabbah, like this anonymous author of the glosses on the Sefer Hamin Hagim of Tirna. Okay, you have the Beit David and the Chidah and the Maram Shik quotes from his Rebbe, the Chasam Sofer, and the Pri Megadim and Ravad Yosef. Interesting, many Sephardic poskim, Dafka Sephardic poskim rule that the obligation is to read each and every parasha from the Torah, and even if a community missed multiple weeks, they would have to read and make up many parshiot, and that becomes important, as we'll see later on this morning, because the current Sephardic chief rabbi, Yitzchak Yosef, paskind like his father and like many Sephardic rabbis that there's an obligation to make up each and every parasha missed. Okay. The Aruch HaShulchan as well, I put here in source number 12, the Aruch HaShulchan, he also writes that you have an obligation to read every single Torah portion publicly, right? To read the Torah publicly, and he writes, he cites this opinion of the Maram Mintz that's cited in Magen Avram. Here he brings down the Magen Avram that we saw, and he writes, those who say that there's no precedent for reading more than two, he says, where do you find that? Where do you find that it's usur to read more than two parshiot on a Shabbat? Yes, we have a precedent of parshiot mechubarot, of double Torah portions, but no one ever said that it's usur to read more than two. Okay, but what about tircha d'tzibura? Okay, so the Aruch HaShulchan would say, well, tircha d'tzibura, but the Or Zarua already said that when it comes to this mitzvah of making up, we don't worry about tircha d'tzibura. It's not called a tircha d'tzibura. Maybe just the opposite. Maybe the community wants to hear the Torah being read. But he asks a question. It's a very important question. Where do you find that there's no precedent? Where do you find that it's usur? No one ever said it's usur to read more than two parshiot on a Shabbat, on a given Shabbat. Right? So it's very tmuim pain. Right? These things, these words, this psak of the Maram Mintz and the Magen Avraham, it's very, very strange, very difficult. It's a wonder, right? Since it's an obligation, the Aruch HaShulchan writes, to make up what they missed. Mali trei, mali tlat. What does it matter if it's two or three or more? Vafilu im lo karu kama Shabbatot nireh shechovah lahashlimam kulam. The Aruch HaShulchan rules. Aruch HaShulchan, very important posek. In Europe before World War II, Aruch HaShulchan was really the last word in Psak Halacha. People would learn the Aruch HaShulchan and the Chai Adam. After World War II, the Mishnah Berurah becomes very important. Maybe the reasons for that. But Aruch HaShulchan is a big lamdan, and there's a lot of lamdus and pilpul. And the Aruch HaShulchan writes that there's an obligation to make up what is missed. So what does it matter whether it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Even if they didn't read a number of weeks, which is our current situation, it would appear that the obligation is to make up each and every parasha missed. Okay, and he says, the Maram Mintz and the Magen Avraham say if it's a double parsha, Vayakal Pekudah, so you can't make it up the next week, Vayikra. So who says? He asks where I've underlined next. Where is the Isser in joining together parshiot, and even the opinion that says you can't join together parshiot from one sefer to the next? That was one of the issues that the Maram Mintz raised. You can't read Vayakal Pekudah on Shabbat Vayikra because we're already in Sefer Vayikra. You can't connect parshiot from one sefer to another. Who says there's an isur? According to the Aruch HaShulchan, there's an obligation to make up each and every missed parasha. And again, many achronim rule like the Aruch HaShulchan. Okay, and interestingly, in Seif Zion, the Aruch HaShulchan rules not just that you would make up the missed parshiot, but you would make up the missed accompanying haftorot, the haftorot that correspond to that week's parasha. So it even suggests that the community make up the corresponding haftorot that were missed. Very interesting. Very interesting here. So as I mentioned, it is a machloket achronim. It is a dispute among the achronim whether we paskin like the Or Zarua, or the way at least the Maram Mintz reads the Or Zarua, and you would only make up 1 week, or no, we have an obligation to read each and every parsha publicly, so you'd make up even multiple weeks. Machloket achronim. And so, it's interesting. It could be that the nekudat hamachloket, the point of dispute, or the point of contention here, the source of the machloket is, do we say that the Torah has to be read in 1 year, that the entire Torah and each and every parasha has to be read in 1 year, or no, like Minhag Eretz Yisrael, that maybe the Torah can be read in 3 years? And yes, there is an obligation to read each and every parasha and make it heard to the Am, as we said at the outset, but that could be done in 3 years. Okay, so it could be that maybe that is the nekudat machloket, whether we say that the Torah has to be read in 1 year, like Minhag Bavel, or no, Minhag Eretz Yisrael, it could be read within 3 years, and because of concerns of tircha d'tzibura, it would be a burden on the community, or because of other concerns like maybe there's no precedent for it to read 3 weeks, to 3 parshot in 1 week, or to connect one sefer, read parshot from one sefer once we've started another sefer, because of those questions. So maybe we could be lenient and say, no, it's not the worst thing in the world if we read the Torah over a period of 3 years on a triennial cycle. Interesting here, I'll put the source sheets back up for a moment. Just for the sake of time, we won't read it together, but I'll summarize. I put here in source number 13 a passage from the Zohar. It would seem from the Zohar that for maybe spiritual reasons, there's, I don't want to say an isur, but maybe it's not appropriate to read parshiot that don't belong to that particular week. To make up, let's say, Parshat Emor on Shabbat Bahar Bechukotai, because Emor belongs to the week of Emor, and Bahar Bechukotai belongs to the week of Bahar Bechukotai. And so here in source number 13, now it's interesting, the Zohar here basically begins with the assumption that we have an obligation to hear every single parsha and every single word and every single letter. Every single word is so holy. Every single letter is so holy. So interesting, by the way, this is the Zohar to Parshat Vayakel, right? Very relevant. Isn't it so ironic? These questions that we saw in the Or Zarua and the Maramintz have to do with Vayakel Pekudei and Vayikra and Emor and Bechukotai, Bahar Bechukotai. So here, this is the Zohar to Parashat Vayakel. Okay, I think actually Vayakel Pekudei was the first week that we missed. I think we had closed the shul that prior week. That was the first week that we missed. So the Zohar there in Parashat Vayakel writes that every letter is important, every word is important, you have to hear every single word, but then concludes by saying that there's a deep spiritual connection between the weekly Torah portion and the week that it's read on. And you can't just willy-nilly or flippantly read this Torah portion on that week or this Torah portion on that week, because there's this deep spiritual connection. And of course, in Kabbalah and Chassidut, there's a lot written on that. There's a lot of ink that's been spilled looking at the weekly Torah portion and connecting it to certain themes of that week. Makes for good Shabbat morning drashot as well, right? So there's a spiritual connection. Now, the Zohar doesn't say it explicitly, but by extension, that would imply that, therefore, maybe you cannot make up weeks on different weeks, or make up missed Torah readings on alternative weeks. That would be maybe what the Zohar implies, and some want to suggest that. I mean, it's interesting, the Or Zarua, as we saw, wasn't concerned with that, wasn't bothered by that. He says, no, we find a precedent for that you make up, right? You make up a Torah reading when Shabbat falls out, or when Yom Tov falls out on Shabbat, right? You push off that Torah reading for that Shabbat. And when do you make it up? When Yom Tov is over. You make it up on that following Shabbat. So the Or Zarua wasn't concerned with that Parsha has to be on a specific week. The Or Zarua assumed, no, you can move things around. And the precedent for that is when Shabbat coincides with Yom Tov, or when Yom Tov coincides with Shabbat. Okay, so that's the Aruch HaShulchan. Now, I didn't put it on the source sheets here, but there's a very, very important work on the laws of Torah reading called the Sharei Ephraim. Okay, the Sharei Ephraim is the work of Rav Ephraim Zalman Margolios, lived from 1762 to 1828. He wrote many important works of halacha. He's considered a very important acharon. And he wrote this really authoritative work on the laws of Torah reading called the Sharei Ephraim, which a lot of the contemporary poskim quote. And the Sharei Ephraim is very important for our question, our question today, the contemporary shaila of whether we have to make up all the parshot that we missed due to this pandemic. Okay, and we'll see that actually a number of the contemporary poskim who've weighed in on this issue. Do we have to, now that we will, Mirz Hashem, open up the shuls once again and reconvene and begin davening together once again and reading the Torah together once again? Many of the contemporary poskim who weighed in on this issue will quote this work, the Sharei Ephraim, which, as I said, is an important authoritative work on the laws of Torah reading. So he writes the following. And this is, I didn't put it on the source sheets. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good edition of the Sha'arei Ephraim. All the editions I had very, very difficult letters, Rashi letters, very bad print. So it wouldn't really be very legible anyway, especially over the screens here, but not really readable. But he writes the following. So he paskins, like the Maram Mintz, the Magen Avraham, and others, that you need not make up multiple Torah readings. You just read the last Parsha missed, but there he allows for those who want to be stringent and read all of the missed Parshiot to do so. Right? If a community wants to be stringent upon themselves, if a minyan wants to be stringent upon themselves, okay, hamachmir tavo alav bracha, kol hakavod. Again, he says it's not required when multiple weeks are missed, but again, allows for those who want to be stringent upon themselves and read all the missed Parshiot to do so. But then he continues and says something really interesting. He says that, however, if the majority of the members of a community were able to hear the Torah read in alternative locations, so then there's no obligation to make up missed Parshiot whatsoever, right? Which is fascinating. Now, there's a rich discussion, I alluded to it before, whether the Torah or public Torah reading, whether Kriyat Torah, public Torah reading, is a chovah, is an obligation on the tzibur, on the community, or on the yachid, on the individual. We assume that the obligation is on the tzibur, on the community. Okay, many of you might be familiar with that. According to Rav Soloveitchik, maybe there's also an obligation on the yachid as well. He would cite his grandfather, Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, and Rav Soloveitchik was famous for when he would fly from Boston to New York to give shiurim at Yeshiva University and would miss Tefillah B'tzibur, let's say on a Monday morning, that Monday afternoon at Mincha, he would have his students take out a Sefer Torah and have them read that particular Kriya. Now, most people would say, you're not obligated to do so because the obligation in Kriyat Torah is on the tzibur, it's on the community, not on the individual. And an individual who misses for whatever reason, right, good reason, bad reason, doesn't have an obligation to make it up. But Rav Soloveitchik, believed that maybe there's also an obligation on the yachid. There's a lot of divrei Torah on that. For the sake of our class this morning, I'm not going to go into all of that. But if we assume that the obligation in Torah reading is on the tzibur, so then if the majority of the tzibur, writes the Sha'arei Ephraim, ends up hearing the Torah, so then there's no obligation to make up any missed parsha whatsoever, because the majority of the tzibur fulfill that obligation for the tzibur. The obligation is on the tzibur. So yes, there are yichidim in that tzibur, members of that community, individuals within that community that did not hear the Torah being read publicly, but you had the majority of that tzibur who heard the Torah, and they fulfill that obligation because the obligation is on the tzibur. It's interesting. That's a relevant point to our discussion this morning because, as I heard from many members of my shul, where I live, we were able to make minyanim with our neighbors in a safe way, from our mirpasaot, from our porches, and people from their ginot, the way my apartment is situated here in Har Nof, we were able to do so, but we didn't have a Sefer Torah. But when I've spoken to many of the members of my shul, they've told me that they've had Sifrei Torah, their neighbors pull out a sefer from the mirpeset. There's a whole shaila. Can you call up people from one mirpeset to get an aliyah on someone else's mirpeset, or down, the guy's down on the street, or he's in his garden, right? He's in his backyard. Can he make the bracha on the Torah and get an aliyah when the Torah is being read on this guy's mirpeset? All sorts of interesting sheilot that have been asked, in the past few months. But many members of my shul have told me that they have not missed Kriyat Torah, or maybe they missed one parsha or two, but they've been able to hear the Torah read publicly. So it's interesting. The Sha'arei Ephraim writes that if the majority of the members of a community were able to hear the Torah in a different location, not in the shul, but in different, there's no obligation to make up the missed parsha whatsoever. So that's important. That's important. Rav Asher Weiss mentions that in his tshuva when he's weighed in on this issue. I'll mention in a moment. And then, and this is really incredible. Okay, then he continues later on and writes that what if there was never a minyan altogether, right? Which would be the situation in many communities in many places. They were not able to make minyanim together with their neighbors. They were in bidud, in quarantine, seger, in lockdown. They were not able to make a minyan all together, okay? And so the Shari Ephraim is this incredible chiddush. If the community never met at all to make a minyan, so there's no obligation in making up the missed parshiot because the community never gathered together to generate the obligation. As we said, right? Without getting into Rav Chaim Brisk Shita and Rav Soloveitchik, but the chovah, the obligation in Kriyat Torah is on the tzibur, it's on the community. What if the community never met? So they never generated the obligation to read the Torah publicly, as the obligation in Torah reading falls on the community and not on the individual. This is an incredible chiddush, that because the members of the shul did not meet, members of the community did not meet, so they never generated the obligation to read the Torah. Never generated the chovah in Kriyat Torah because the chovah is on the tzibur. And okay, so they missed. So there's no obligation if we never met, according to the Shari Ephraim, to read the Torah public or to make up the parshiot missed. You don't have to make up the parshiot missed since there was never a chovah to begin with. The chovah in Kriyat Torah was never generated by it. It's an incredible chiddush. Okay? And that this leniency of the Shari Ephraim is especially relevant in light of the current situation. Some members, or some community rather, some communities had a majority of the members who were able to continue and read from the Torah on mirpasot and gardens or outdoors, as I mentioned, which would, according to the Shari Ephraim, exempt the rest of the community from the obligation to make up missed Torah readings, while other communities had no minyan at all. They didn't meet at all, and so therefore they didn't generate the obligation in public Torah reading. So in both situations, it would exempt those different communities from making up any of the missed parshiot according to the Shari Ephraim. Okay? And that's important because, as I mentioned, some of the contemporary poskim who've weighed in on this issue have quoted the Shari Ephraim. I mentioned that the Sephardic chief rabbi, the Rishon LeZion Rav Yitzchak Yosef, ruled that communities must read each and every parasha that was missed, okay? Which would be the psak of the majority of Sephardic poskim, and something that he has written already in the name of his father. Okay, that was Rav Ovadia Yosef's psak, that if you miss parshiot, even if it's multiple weeks, you make them up. Again, that's seems to be how the majority of the Sephardic poskim rule. However, in recent weeks, Rav Asher Weiss, whom I already mentioned, Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, and Rav Hershel Schechter from YU all ruled leniently that communities need not make up missed parshiot. Now, Rav Asher Weiss in his tshuva, he cites the Shari Ephraim, which we just mentioned, and says, it's a suffix. Maybe there's no chiyuv at all, right? Either because people were reading, the majority of the shul was reading, some families couldn't, they, based on where their homes were situated, they didn't have a Sefer Torah, they didn't have access, but some people, or other communities didn't meet at all to generate the obligation. So Rav Asher Weiss is making, says, maybe there's no chiyuv at all. There's all these sfeikot that he puts together, and so he rules this, it's not necessary to make up parshiot. Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon and Rav Schechter, they rule leniently that communities don't have an obligation to make up these missed parshiot. It would be a major burden to tircha tzibur, but they leave room for those communities, like the Shari Ephraim does, for those communities who do want to make them up. So, if you're in a shul that, wants to spend hours and hours and hours making up all these parshiot, give them to hey, okay? As long as the community gives its permission, then it's not a tircha tzibur. And as long as people get permission from their wives to spend all day in shul, I guess, right? Rav Rimon actually suggests in his tshuva that it's a good idea. He says it's not required, but it's a good idea to have at least a group of people in each community making up the readings for the entire community. Again, as we said, according to most opinions, the obligation in Kriyat Torah is on the tzibur. So if you have at least a group representing the community making up all these Torah readings, so then everyone is yotzei, so to speak. So Rimon rules that a community need not make up all the Torah readings, but he writes it's a good idea. It's a good idea to have at least a group of people in the community doing so. Okay. As synagogues here in Israel have been closed since mid-March, making up all these missed parshiot would take hours and hours, which I think is a burden that most communities would not be able to bear. So individuals who would like to be stringent, members of a community that want to be stringent, even if you have a shul or a minyan, that the whole shul or minyan wants to be stringent upon themselves and make up all the misparshiot. Again, hamachmir tavo alav bracha, gesundte hey, kol hakavod. It's a good thing. Just make sure you have permission of every member of the shul, every member of the minyan, and permission from your wives. But communities that do not want to make up any of the misparshiot certainly have whom to rely upon. I will take some questions. I'll unmute the microphones now and take any questions. Unmute all. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, would you make a bracha if you're reading it?
You would. There's a whole question of actually how you would make up these parshiot, how you would divide them in aliyot. I can't get into it now, but you would call up Rishon, you'd call up the Kohen for Rishon, and you would read every parsha missed, and perhaps the first aliyah of that week's parasha, that would be Rishon, and then you would continue with Sheni Ve'eloch. Okay, but there's a little bit of a discussion amongst the poskim as to how exactly you would do that, how would you implement that halacha l'maaseh. But make up any missed parsha in the first aliyah. Together with the first part of that missed parsha, and then continue. But these rules are not really so black and white. It's not so, as you know, when we have special Shabbatot like in Shabbat Chanukah, which is Chodesh, right? We can divide things up differently. We play around. We've got a double parsha. So discussion amongst the poskim. Any other questions?
My question is, since when have we been reading the 1 year Torah cycle? When was that established?
So the Gemara already mentions it in Megillah Daf Chavtet Amud Bet that in Bavel the practice was to read in 1 year, but the Minhag Eretz Yisrael was to read in 3 years. So it would seem that sometime maybe in the Kufat HaAmoraim, maybe it developed that way. That already in Bavel the custom developed such. It's a whole question as to when the Rambam mentions that there are those communities who still read on a 3-year cycle, a triennial cycle, but that is not the minhag, that's not the accepted minhag. It's a whole question as to what is the attitude of the Rambam. By saying that, does the Rambam mean that that's not a good practice or an unacceptable practice? But we assume it develops sometime in the Tufat HaAmoraim, the period of the Amorim, the period when the Gemara is being taught and developed and written. Any other questions? Okay, have a wonderful day. Take care. See you all in Mitzvah Shem next Wednesday.
Thank you.